Welcome to the Grazing Grass Podcast, episode 69.
Jump in, but make sure you're doing your research and you have a plan at least 2 steps ahead. You're going to think at least 2 steps ahead where they're going to be. Otherwise, you're going to fall behind.
You're listening to the Grazing Grass Podcast, helping grass farmers learn from grass farmers. And every episode features a grass farmer and their operation. I'm your host, Cal Hardage. Imagine a world where ranching nurtures our earth. Welcome to the vision of the Noble Research Institute. This nonprofit champions regenerative agriculture, turning research into practical solutions for farmers and ranchers. On their 14,000-acre of working ranches, they showcase principles that enhance soil health, boost grazing productivity, and uplift the entire ecosystem. Excitingly, they've just launched Essentials of Regenerative Ranching, a hands-on course for those eager to pioneer change in agriculture. And keep an ear out for their upcoming grazing class this fall. For a sustainable future in ranching, turn to the Noble Research Institute. Learn more on their website at noble.org. That's noble.org. On today's episode, we have Joshua Deck, and we have a wonderful show for you today. He's coming from grazing from a different angle than we usually talk about. He is a homesteader, and he found grazing so that he can better manage his land and his livestock. And while he's not producing meat for sale to others, he is growing meat for his own family. So a little bit different angle than usual. I think you'll really enjoy it. And then for the overgrazing topic, we're going to talk about mushrooms. Before we talk to Joshua, 10 seconds about my farm. I was looking at Facebook earlier today, and in one of the groups I'm part of, they were talking about corral design and flow of cattle through it. And they were talking about they were unable to get the cattle to flow through their corral very well. One of the biggest things that I've done that's made a tremendous difference is that whenever I have my cows or my dad's cows up near our corral, and we have a stationary corral that system built, that I just run the cows through it. And I say run, I take it very slow and I just push them through it, and I'm not catching them in the head gate or anything, but they just know to go through the alley. They have to go into the tub and then through the alley. First few times, I just did it like I was working cows, but I didn't catch anything. So I can put about 6 head in my tub, and then I can push them into my alley, and they would go on, and then I'd open the gate and do it. The last time I had my cows go through the chute, I didn't even have anyone to help me push them in. They just knew that was the way out. I worked slowly and calmly, and they fed themselves. Now, I was doing that by myself, so that makes a big difference. Well, I'm curious, are there things that you do to make those times when you're messing with your cows more efficient? Jump over to the Facebook group, Grazing Grass Community on Facebook, and share it with us. Enough about that. Let's talk to Joshua. Joshua, we want to welcome you to the Grazing Grass Podcast. We're excited you're here today.
Thanks, Cal. I'm excited to be here.
Joshua, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your operation?
What I guess you would consider a homesteader. I'm not really running an operational farm where I'm actually bringing an income off the farm. It's more about self-sustenance and sustaining ourselves, trying to be more self-reliant, realizing we still rely on a lot of outside inputs. But we have 20 acres in southwest Missouri, and it's mostly about 5 acres of it is woods, and then the other 15 acres is kind of old field, had been plowed probably about 20 years ago. It sat for a few years, maybe kind of used as a pasture, but I don't really think it was really grazed much. And then it was bush hogged. Actually, the one neighbor to my north said he bush hogged it about 15 years ago for the people that had owned it at the time. For the last 15 years, it's just sat kind of untouched. So it's in various stages of succession, a lot of different plants, trees, grasses, all kinds of good forage. but it's kind of starting to take over and get too thick. So kind of coming here, we had the intention, I wanted to get animals, but I had a kind of I shouldn't say I had a conventional mindset, but my thought process was always kind of a conventional, well, I just need a paddock here and a couple acres there. And when I really started to just, when I do something, I try to research it. So I started to read a lot of different, grazing books, articles, mainly a lot of articles, led me to books, got a few books. And I realized, I really need to be trying to do this regeneratively and moving them across the landscape. That's where we kind of thought, well, let's get some sheep. The neighbor gave me 2 goats, gave my son and I a goat for gifts. We ended up getting Dexter cattle. So we've been on this homestead about 1 year now, just over a year. And we got animals this spring. It's kind of the first year we kind of landed here. We did do some pastured poultry last year, which we've been doing on previous properties that we've been at, raised around 50 or so kosher kings, which are like a Freedom Ranger chicken. So they're not your standard Cornish crosses. They're a little bit more apt to free range and try to get their own food. They take a little bit longer to develop, but I think overall my feed cost is probably around the same, even though it might take 3 to 4 weeks longer than say a Cornish cross. We've also done ducks, and we do layer chickens. We've done ducks for eggs and turkeys for eggs and meat. So that we had all done last year and previous years on other properties that we were at. But, this is our first year to actually have some 4-legged livestock, and we kind of jumped into it and got a bunch going all at once and bit off a lot, and I'm still chewing to try to catch up. But
now, you mentioned when you started researching about grazing, you were reading articles. Where were you finding those articles? Were they online or did the magazine?
A lot of it came from, I was really into studying permaculture, probably back starting in 2016. I kind of got into permaculture. I took a permaculture design course in 2017. So a lot of the regenerative principles are talked about and taught there, and kind of permaculture and regenerative ag, I would say are close cousins, in my opinion. It's all these things are just different terms that are obviously thrown around, but those worlds like the regenerative ag, homesteading, kind of permaculture worlds all kind of run together. So that's where I did, hear about it. Permies.com was a website that, they have a lot of different boards and posts and kind of reading a lot of stuff there. One of the first livestock books I guess I read was one about parasite management. And it was just the big deal was just not leaving them on the same paddock because, and we can get into a little bit more when we talk about maybe my personal journey, which kind of propels all this with my family. But, we want to raise them without all the antibiotics, without having to treat them for worms and everything else, because, we're trying to develop the reason we want to have our own food and control, produce our own stock and game, maybe about 2012 or sometime in there. So about a little over a decade ago, my wife and I were pretty much living like the standard American life. We both had regular jobs. I was, driving to an office every day. She was driving to an office. We did have a 14-acre property. I wanted to get animals, but I just never felt like I had the time. I had too much work and I just didn't feel like I had the time. We were not, eating healthy. We didn't really kind of think about it. And then because of some minor health issues that I was experiencing, my wife, we kind of decided that, well, hey, maybe we got to start cleaning up our diet a little bit. And then we watched Food Inc. And I think that was a big game changer, the movie Food Inc. So probably around that time, we saw that and kind of got introduced to Joe Salatin there. And a lot of things started clicking. So we started to clean up our diet. Really, we went on a paleo diet, real strict paleo diet, which is, mainly just meat and not even any grains. We became better health. And then we kind of, at the same time, we started on a spiritual journey where, we kind of got more grounded in our spiritual life, took that seriously, started attending the congregation and kind of, changed our life and, gave ourselves over to the Messiah. And that really propelled me to study scripture. And in studying scripture, I kind of started to understand that all the forefathers of the faith, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were all shepherds. And just the Israelites as whole and the whole religion, really the whole scriptures, the whole Bible is based on agriculture. From the Messiah's parables, Jesus, or I would say Yeshua, but from the Messiah's parables to all the way back to through the Old Testament, all the way through Paul's letters, there's all kinds of references to agriculture in there.
Oh, yeah.
And, one of the big things that really made me think about this is, in Genesis 2:7, it says that Yahweh Elohim or Lord God formed man of the dust from the ground and breathed in him the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. And kind of that realization that we're made from the soil, essentially. The word there where it says from the dust of the ground is ha'adamah. Man is Adam in Hebrew. So Adam is man, and Adamah is ground, soil. So there's actually the same root word for both of them. So we're of that. So kind of that in that time period, there was a whole journey of kind of recognizing and realizing that, soil health is important. It's important what we put in our bodies. And that kind of really propelled us along the journey.
And at the time, did you say you were living in Pennsylvania?
Yeah. So we were living in Pennsylvania. We kind of moved around a little bit there, had a few different properties through this journey. We actually ended up in town for a little bit. After my son was born, we moved closer to my in-laws just to try to help, with my son and having a baby and everything like that. So we moved into town. We were in town for about a year, and we're not town people. I grew up in the country. I worked on dairy farms and horse farms, and I never really lived in town, but I thought it was a neat little town, tree-lined street. And I was really getting into gardening at that time. So I had a garden in the backyard. It was actually a lot of blacktop. I ripped it all up, brought in a bunch of topsoil, planted a whole garden. But then we decided, it's not what we were going to do. So we found 2 acres of land that we got for a good deal and kind of cashed in a lot of the different savings that we had and went out and built up this 2-acre property. And that's right around the time I took my permaculture design course, because I was trying to really look at it. It was a steep hillside. At that time, I had an idea. Well, I wanted to have 2 sheep. It'd be fun to have 2 sheep. But it just, even on 2 acres, once I got there, I realized I really didn't have the room for them. But we were there for several years and did a lot of gardening. We did run chickens there. That's kind of our first experience with chickens and ducks and integrating them. And, through permaculture systems in our little 2-acre garden, did a lot of swales and berms and made little pasture areas. It was nice. It was 2 little acres, easy to manage, and my little pastures that I ran the chickens when I didn't have chickens on them. I just cut them as a scythe for hay. And it was a little mini farm, but it was fun. But I guess I kind of wanted more of a challenge, and some people we knew, an older couple were downsizing, and they had a 20-acre property that was up on top of a mountain back in Pennsylvania. Now we were in Southeast Pennsylvania, but it was kind of this rocky hilltop, but there was some area on it and it was a lot of woods. And I thought, well, I'm going to try to do a woodland homestead. I had read a couple books about woodland homesteads, and, I was up for that challenge after our 2-acre, our property we were on for several years. So we moved up there, and we were there for about a year, and that's when COVID happened. And then COVID kind of enabled me to start to work from home. And after a few months of that, and kind of not knowing where the world was going, and kind of and realizing that the debt load we had there, and just the soils, everything else, it really wasn't going to, be the best spot for a homestead. We decided to move out to Missouri, which we had already kind of had in mind for years, because there's a lot of people that kind of in our walk of faith that are out here, some family that I had out here. So we moved out to Missouri. Our first homestead was a 10-acre place that was kind of in the woods. Some garden spot, places there. And I was going to try to build in silvopasture, which I was working on, running chickens and turkeys there, gardening, different reasons. We ended up selling and kind of did when homesteads were really shooting up. Just over a year ago, homestead prices were shooting up, and I kind of always kept my eye on real estate. And we thought, well, let's kind of see what happens. And our place sold in like a weekend. I mean, there was it was crazy. People were coming, offers were coming in. Nobody that didn't even see the place. They just looked at it online, and we ended up selling that place. We're going to buy another place that fell through. And then this place we came up, and it was after a lot of prayer that we were able to buy this property where we're at now, the 20 acres.
Sounds like a very interesting journey. So you spent some time with your homestead getting that permaculture principles going in place. And then you've got this new property you moved into. Tell us how you got started with that property, what you did to where you are now.
I had to make some quick decisions when we decided to buy it, just because properties were coming on the market and going quick. There's several things over the years after being on different homesteads and properties and trying to understand what works best. One of the first things I looked at was, the NRCS web soil survey to try to see what kind of soils were on there. We had decent soils, a barred and silt loam, and I saw the potential kind of almost like a canvas in the stage of succession that had variable stages. So where our house is, and that's kind of where everything starts in our like zone, 0, zone 1, our house kind of enters like the gateway of the property. And then behind, or I like to think of it in front of our house, there's about 5 acres of pretty mature oaks, pecans, and really a whole big mix of hardwoods, Missouri hardwoods, right around the property. So that kind of creates a nice just place to live, where it's a nice wooded spot. We have a couple openings where we have some gardens in, but we're really not doing any grazing yet in those areas. I'm going to a lot of it's going to be dedicated to mushroom cultivation. It's, there was a house on the property, a pole barn house. There was an old kind of cabin. We call it the rack shack. That's where our deer racks are and stuff like that. And, there was a bunch of little miscellaneous outbuildings and a pretty new pole barn. So it's a nice kind of landing spot to come in, and a lot of that infrastructure was done. We did put a greenhouse in, and there wasn't really a good dedicated garden. There was an area that had been, the previous guy was kind of mowing as a yard that we're in the process of converting it into a garden. So I've been digging swales and doing like a mounded bed system with paths and then garden beds, where we're kind of doing some small cover crops right now, mainly because it's our first year that we've really gardened there, and a few just typical vegetables, but it's not real big yet. And then, like I said, really the balance of the property, probably 15 acres, is what's going to be dedicated to grazing. But it's really, like I said, old field, which is within permaculture, you kind of learn about the various stages of succession. But, disturbance would be like kind of a plowed field. And then you kind of get to like a grass, prairie area growing in. And then you kind of get into what they call an old field, which is basically, there's still a lot of, here we have a mixture of prairie species like gamma grass, Indian grass, blue stem, little and big blue stem. There's no thick pockets of it. It's all kind of just sporadic. There's a little bit there is some fescue, because we're in Missouri and there's fescue, everywhere. It grows everywhere around here. So there's a little bit of fescue in there, a lot of berry canes, a little bit of molliflower rosebush, but there's also a lot of Cerisa lesbideza that made its way in here, which has actually been pretty good for the goats and the sheep. They seem to like it. But besides that, there's so many other forbs that I don't even know them all. I can't even identify them all. But having that mix is, to start with, I feel blessed by that, because I think a lot of people are trying to get to that. What I'm trying to do as trying to manage it as I graze it, and as I'm trying to remove, thin some trees out. There's a lot of ash, and we have the emerald ash borer coming through, which we had that in Pennsylvania. And I saw what it did. My dad has a 55-acre farm in Pennsylvania, and the emerald ash borer just wiped out his woods, because it was predominantly ash, and it took them all out in a couple years. So the borer is already here. It's been seen in our county in Missouri. So I know it's only a matter of time. So I'm not going to really, put stock in I'll keep a few, but on a lot of those ash trees, I'm trying to encourage things like the pecans, the persimmons, oaks, especially oaks. There's quite a bit of oak, and I'm trying to encourage the growth of favorite hardwoods, leaving some cedar, because I noticed that the stock definitely liked the cedars. Number one, on a hot day where it's kind of hot and flies, they kind of crawl in, they get themselves in there, and it seems like the flies stay off of them pretty good. So that definitely seems like a reasonable species. At first, the first areas, I was actually probably cleaning too much cedar off. Now, as I'm going, I'm trying to leave a little bit more for them. In the core of the property, there's actually a nice cedar thicket. that I'm intending to use kind of as in the winter time when it gets real bad, to try to run them in there and keep them in there at times as like a natural barn, so to say, just to kind of keep them sheltered, because I don't have a barn for any of them, other than I did make some little temporary run-ins that I used because I was milking one of the Dexter cows. So it was basically a place I can take her in to milk them. And then where they're grazing now, I actually am grazing neighboring property. That was a CRP field, and it was all about 15 years ago or so. It was seeded into a native prairie mix, and they burned it off this past spring after years of just having a lot of growth on it. They burnt the whole thing off, made hay on about half of it, what they could. It might have been about a 200-acre plot or so. Made hay on some of it, but a lot of it was overgrown. The neighbor, real nice fellow, he allowed me to graze my cattle on it, on anything that they didn't make hay on. So I'm very thankful for that, because we've been in a really bad drought here where we're at, and we're just we're still in it, but at least we're getting some rain. We got some rain today. I have them down there and they're doing great. And that's the nice thing about rotational grazing, especially with the cattle. I'm running 2 wires, and it's just the Premier one. I have I think it's the IntelliShock 80. So it's the 0.8 joules output. And then running 2 strands of the poly rope. So the heavier kind of diameter stuff. And, it takes a little bit, but I've actually kind of speeded up. Once you've done it a few times, you definitely get more efficient with it. So I'm moving them every few days. I'm definitely not overgrazing his property. I'm trying to actually do a good job with it and show the benefits of that versus just even making hay, because, with the hay, they cut it so short, and it doesn't have, that the blade length. And I'm trying to keep, I might be getting on that, a lot of it when it's 24 to 36 inches, and I'm only grazing it down to maybe about, a foot or not less than a foot. And it's amazing to see the results of it already. I mean, just in a few weeks of grazing on that ground that hasn't been grazed in who knows how long. I mean, it was actually a row crop before that. It was put into that CRP field, and, it's bouncing back, and it's got, just in the last few weeks, several inches of growth and looking really nice.
One thing you mentioned earlier, when you got that property, you immediately started looking at your forages, and not only for your livestock, but for yourself. What are you going to grow? Your garden area, getting things set up for that. And then you had mentioned you thought about sheep before. Were sheep your first impulse, and you're like, oh, I need to get some sheep to go on here? Or what was your thought pattern to figure out what kind of livestock you wanted, and then the steps you took to implement that?
Yes, I wanted sheep. Just again, going back to my biblical worldview that I have, I just think of Jacob and his flocks of sheep, and I actually wanted to get Jacob's sheep. I really liked the look of them and stuff. But here in Missouri, it's just Katahdin hair sheep. I don't have anything registered, but there was a friend of mine that had a pretty good flock, so I made a deal with him and bought a few ewes, and then I got a couple rams that I'm going to butcher this fall. And then another friend of mine that had Katahdin hair sheep, he actually had a red ram I got from him, and I'm going to use those as my breeding flock. But yeah, so the sheep were just kind of always, I don't know, my biblical worldview. I wanted to have sheep. The funny part of it though was, when you a lot of people say, well, sheep are so great. Goats are just a pain. They're a pain. Well, my neighbor, who's been a great help, Roger, he's, moving in here. He's been here for the past 20 some years, but a Missouri resident his whole life, farmer, rancher, just a huge asset. I mean, I wouldn't be even where I am right now in the past, couple months of getting livestock if it wasn't for his help and guidance, so having a good mentor is really awesome. But at any rate, he gave us 2 bottle goats. So my son and I, he gave us 2 bottle goats, and my wife loves them, my son loves them, and they're almost like dogs, so, especially since they were bottle goats. But then we run them with the does right now, or with the ewes. So the does and the ewes are running together. That's how we ended up with goats. But now that I've had them, the sheep seem to be more skittish and can be a little bit more difficult moving than the goats. The goats are so easy. The goats are no problem. They just walk right up to you and you can move them around wherever. The sheep, they just want to run away from us at the time. And, the rams aren't as bad as the ewes, but for whatever reason, the ewes are really, really flighty. And then the Dexters. So we were considering getting a Jersey cow, but we were kind of, would it be too much milk for what we want? My wife does want to, she wants to make her own. Well, she has, because we were getting raw milk from a friend, but, making our own cheeses and yogurts and a lot of our own dairy products, plus having good raw milk. So that kind of is why we wanted to have a cow. Not that we want to have a commercial, that I want to be selling dairy, but it's really just our own personal goal. I actually have a goal. I want to minimize the need for, I have a tractor. I have a small 24 horsepower New Holland tractor that I've actually had from our 2-acre homestead for years. So this I drug it out here in the back of a U-Haul trailer. I had to take it apart and everything. But at any rate, I've been dragging it around, but I want to kind of get away from that and move to draft power. So originally, my mind went to horses, but then after about a year ago, I kind of started thinking about oxen, and that's where Dexters kind of seem like they'd be a good fit because they're a tri-purpose breed. You can get dairy out of them, which, they don't produce a ton, but you can get enough for your own personal consumption. And then you can use them, obviously they're good for meat and they are good for, they can be used for oxen, but they're on the smaller size. And since we're on a 20-acre homestead with only a little bit of additional ground, which I probably won't have next year. So that's where I just got to keep a small herd size on the Dexter, and they're really more so just for our own personal meat, dairy. And then, like I said, I wouldn't mind having some oxen. And actually you had a guest a few episodes ago, really kind of inspired me to that again. Not that it's still in the back of my mind, but I wasn't really worried about it, but
Kevin was on here not too many episodes ago, I think episode 60, and he was talking about oxen. Well, as listeners of the podcast know, if they've listened to any time at all, I'm interested in everything. I think oxen would be so much fun. It'd be work, but I just don't have time for it.
It's one of those things. Especially coming from that permaculture mindset of trying to reduce our foreign inputs and our reliance on heavy metals and things like that. It just, the oxen kind of makes sense. I'm a firm believer and in kind of we've kind of gone so far, and technology has done great things for us, but I think that we're using it, and most of society is using it too much as a crutch. And, we've completely forgot our ecological memory. And I really believe it's time to kind of look to the ancient paths again and start to try to settle down and live our lives a little more simply and a little closer to the land, because I think that's really a lot of the answers with most of the world's problems. If we just kind of thought about living a little more simply, I think our world would change a lot.
Yeah. And I think with the homesteading movement, that to me, looking in from the outside, it seems like it's growing momentum and really a lot going on there. And, I follow a few people on YouTube that's homesteading, and I like to think that some of the things I do is very relatable to homesteading. With my beef cattle and my sheep, I do it on a much larger scale. But, I got a few chickens. I've got some Quaternius quail. I've got some beehives. I kind of like that. Sadly, I haven't been able to introduce much of those permaculture principles into my zones around my house. But maybe one day, we'll see how it goes. But I think you coming on here, there's lots of homesteaders out there, and there's lots of people interested in permaculture. Adding that grazing feature to it, I think is great. And I think a lot of people just wondering where to get started. So you talked about bringing those animals in, and you talked a little bit about your electric fence. What were some issues you had there just getting started with your sheep? So you brought them in. Was that your first time with sheep? Did you have any prior experience with them?
That was my first real experience with sheep, when I was, 20 years ago when I was a teenager, I worked on a dairy farm for a while, and I also worked on a horse farm for a season. So I was familiar with, cattle and horses, but not so much with sheep, with that size livestock. The guy that I got him from in the past, year or so, just kind of seeing, now he wasn't using really rotational grazing, at least at that level. He had about 2 different pastures he'd kick him back and forth to just as he needed to. But, as far as handling them and stuff, kind of where I learned from that. But I just brought him home in the back of my pickup truck, with a cattle panel. I just folded a cattle panel up in 4 and put him up in there and hauled him back. And I had done a little bit of work ahead of time, basically going through and clearing paths. And I'm just using the sheep net from Premier One for the sheep and goat net. So, it's great, but it's horrible on an old field where you have all kinds of things like, staghorn sumac growing up and all the so anytime you move it, it gets caught on every little piece of debris, every little stick, and it can get frustrating. That's probably been, I'm going to say, one of my biggest challenges is actually moving my sheep. And it's actually made us, my wife and I have talked about it, about maybe just downsizing the sheep and kind of sticking with the Dexters and the goats, and really just to have at least to have 2 animals. I want to at least have 2 different kinds of animals. The sheep and the goats share the same parasites, but the cattle don't. So they actually can act as dead end hosts to each other if you're running them either together or even, in a leader follow system. So I'm thinking about maybe making changes with that. We'll see what happens this fall when I start butchering the sheep, the rams. But that was probably our biggest challenge. And then water was a real big challenge because we have a well, and I do have at our garden area, I did put in a 3,000 gallon rainwater catchment tank that I'm catching all the rainwater coming off the front side of the pole barn. And that's going into a tank, but it's been a dry year. I only got it up in April. So I missed the March rains, and April was completely dry. We got a little bit of rain in May, but the back half of May, all of June, and most of July were all dry. So, I ran that thing out, and I had a 55 gallon drum and a little cart, and on the back of the lawnmower or on the back of the tractor, and just hauling it back, giving them water that way. But it's a learning curve. And now I got a bigger trailer. So I got a truck bed trailer I found on Craigslist, and I have a IBC 275 gallon tote. But I only fill it to about 150 gallons because otherwise, especially in the heat, the water, before the cattle get through the water, it gets too hot, so I got that hooked up to a garden hose and just one of those little giant automatic water floats and a tub. And that's made my life a lot easier. So, just figuring out the best water system to be able to follow these cattle around. And so far that's it. The sheep, the sheep and goats aren't bad at all. 5 gallon bucket a day gets them through is all they need. And I just have that 55 gallon drum in the back yet that we fill it up. And then it's one of my son's tasks to go and fill up the tank, so. And that's one of the exciting things about homesteading and grazing. He's right there with me. He's 9 years old, and he loves doing it. He likes going out when we move the animals, and we do have, we have 2 livestock guardian dogs that I didn't talk about yet that we do have with the sheep. And one of his duties is to take care of the dogs, make sure the dogs are fed, so to me, it's great because it gives him a job, a purpose, and teaches him responsibility.
Oh yeah, very true. Just jumping back with the sheep and the cattle, working with a small number there, water is always an issue, but when you're working with a smaller number, especially with sheep and goats, because their water requirements are so much less than cattle. But you're able to solve that and provide and have a solution for getting them water without a lot of issue. For example, for me and water is always a limiting factor, and I've got to make sure they've got access to a pond or something. One year, I guess last year, we were really dry, and I hauled water over to one of the properties I leased because both ponds were dry. But I was hauling 2 of those IBC totes, which I estimated enough for that small. I only had about 10 cows over on that property. And I estimated it to be plenty and almost enough for 2 days. But in reality, they were not getting near that amount of time out of it. And I was having to fill it every day. It got really cumbersome for how much time and work that was taking. But when you're working with a smaller number, you're able to do some of those things that you can't do with a larger number. So just getting started, it makes it a little bit easier. And just to continue on my little rambling here, that Premier One netting makes it so easy to get started with sheep and goats. I do agree. It will catch on everything out in your pasture, and it will have you saying words that you shouldn't say. But it works. I mean, you can get out there, you can throw you up where you need it. You're hauling water out there. So with just a few head, you can have a lot going on with just a few items for fencing and stuff, rather than having to go in and do a whole bunch of infrastructure to get started. That's the beauty, or that's one of the beauties to me of electric fence. With the netting, or even with your Dexter cows using your poly rope, your infrastructure costs are a lot less to get started.
Yeah, I mean, and they are, and they're great tools. One of the things that I have to, consider is with the netting, where the poly wire is nice because you can make it whatever size you need it to be, and you just roll up the excess. With the netting, you have to make sure, and it's tough when I'm trying to work around a lot of trees that I'm trying to leave in, so I'm trying to look and line things up and measure, and I'll cut. And then sometimes you got to come back when you get the netting up and like, oh no, I got to come over. I got to mow a little over here because I got to run it kind of around this way now, so, but it's all in the process, and it's working good because I can be real adaptive with where I'm grazing them, how I'm grazing them, like you said. So it is a great tool, and it's allowing me to kind of get the land cleared off. I'm not saying cleared off, but like, just try to, it's so much, to get them in there, and even the sheep, to get them and the goats in there, eating a lot of those forbs, trampling stuff. The Dexters, they've been down on the neighboring property, so they haven't been doing too much, which is fine because it's been so dry. It's worked. It's actually really been a blessing, but I'm excited to get I'm going to stop grazing that sometime here in the beginning of September, and then bring them back up to my property, which I'm excited to get them back up there because I want to get their manure and urine and them trampling everything down, too, and moving them around up, back up on my property again. But, having that number, it's allowing me to get started. And then, the big thing with permaculture is you don't even want to start on a permaculture design on a property until you've been there for a year and kind of watched it over 4 seasons. And then that's when, that's a hard thing because I want to get going right away and I want to start, so I mean, I kind of plugged away at the projects that I knew, things that I knew I was going to do. Well, this is the only place it really makes sense to put it in a garden. So let's at least start planning and going with that. But even that has changed, and, just starting, you end up changing. And it's the same thing with the grazing, where I'm learning, where I have better, what are my drier pastures? What are my wetter areas? I'm trying to come up with a system. I'm thinking to use like a laneway system of T-posts and probably 5 or 6 wire fence, where I'll probably have at least 3 hot wires on that, and then use poly wire across, and then be able to move them daily and have about 4 or 5 runs of that, maybe about 100 to 150 feet across, and kind of segment off my property. There's a good book called The Permaculture Market Garden. And it's not really about grazing, although it talks about integrating animals and stuff like that, and probably gives a little nod, or just at least a mention, to rotational grazing. But it's really about actually setting up a market garden. However, in there, it talks about basically breaking your property down into grids and starting to map it and understand it. And now, whether that's you take, say, maybe a grid is 100 by 100 or 100 by 50, and then you grid off your property. But, having that in mind with your pastures, and then you can start to use that grid that you have to say, well, this pasture up here is, these are my wet seasons. These are my, this is where I want to have them when it's dry. And kind of, it really helps teach that holistic mindset of trying to break your property into sections and understanding it and being able to, adapt your grazing that way. And again, it's not about grazing. It's about setting up a market garden, but integrating, it's a permaculture. So you're integrating whatever, based on the size of your land, farming in context.
And that's kind of an interesting subject, that grid like, or however. I know I've been a listener and follower of Greg Judy for a long time. And I know he says when he first started out, he had some semi-permanent fences so that he could rotate his cows easily. And then as he's gotten more experience and more time on his hands, he's taken those fences out so he can really design his pastures the way he wants with polywire. So for me, my dad's land, we have permanent fences in, and that's how I control the rotation. For lease land, I'm just using polywire and designing my paddocks. But one of my lease lands, I have a 10-year contract on, and I am thinking about doing kind of a grid on it so that moving cattle takes me less time. And sadly, the way my property is located, I've got a few properties, and I have to run 2 herds of cattle, and then plus I have my dad's herd. So by the time I get to doing all that, time runs short. So I'm just thinking a grid like that frees you up to do some other things, even though there may be some negatives. But I've been thinking about that grid, or kind of using a basis of a grid for what I'm doing. So it's kind of interesting you brought that up.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me now that I've been kind of, sitting down and turning, if all I got to do is go and essentially, pull my couple poly wires across, let the cattle will be more than, or the sheep, they'll be more than eager to get to the next one. And then I can, pull them back across and then just basically strip graze them up through there. And I think that's the biggest thing. Cause I would love to move all my animals faster across the property. But I'm probably moving the cattle every 5 days, and I try to make the paddock sizes that they last, which they've been, so I've been trying to judge that, but it's all learning process. I never did it before. So it's trying to judge it. And the first time I set up a paddock, that's like, well, no, I gotta go a little bit bigger, move them a little quicker. And, I'm kind of limited with the fence. I do have a few extra, but really I need my extra net to be able to create my next paddock, and then run the sheep into it, and then, start shuffling fences. It's a whole, kind of dance of moving them all around, especially since I'm keeping the rams separate from the ewes because I'm trying to avoid winter lambing. Everybody, right here in Missouri, everybody that I know, everybody's lambing the end of December through February. And, we get those really cold spells, right around that time where it gets well below zero, and guys are bringing lambs into the house and stuff like that. Not that not that I wouldn't do that if I had to, but why lose the sleep? Why have to worry about it, so much? I would rather just try to let it happen natural. So I'm probably going to shoot for November, December to put the ram in with the ewes, so that they're going to lamb hopefully when sometime in May, April, May. So just, that kind of makes sense to me. The Dexters, so I didn't talk a whole lot about Dexters yet. I do have a bull. So we have 2 cows, a heifer. And the cow had a bull calf. So he's now a steer. He's Sirloin is his name. So he knows his lot in life, but and then he actually came with that name, the people we got him from, which that's a whole story in itself, which I can get into. But really and then we have a bull, Fritz the bull. And the reason we kind of decided, so backing up and getting into it a little bit more, we were looking and thinking we wanted a Jersey, but then we were kind of going back and forth. Well, we knew we didn't want a Jersey bull. So I knew I was going to either have to take him somewhere, do AI. I'm not, that's not what I want to do in my homestead, trying to kind of keep things more of a pure, more naturalist type of view, I guess I would just put it. So we kind of leaned away from that. We're thinking about Dexters, and we were just looking at Craigslist, and we had the goal to get cows this summer. And coming into it, once we got the sheep and the goats, we kind of thought, oh, maybe that's all we're going to get this year. But we looked on Craigslist, and there were this herd of cows were available. And actually it was a different cow that was part of that herd that was originally on there. And I contacted the guy who we become really good friends with, talked to me. He said, well, I have another cow, and I also have a heifer and I have a bull for sale, that I'm going to probably consider selling too. Because he has a 10-acre homestead down outside of Springfield. Then he leased 10 acres across the road, which was the pasture for the cattle. Well, he lost that lease. That piece of land sold. He had to get them off. And so, he had no choice but to sell them. And I got the whole group, at a reasonable price. And so it kind of made it worth it to do it, because pretty much for as much as we were budgeting and think we were going to spend on the Jersey cow, we ended up with a whole herd of Dexters, which was kind of something we wanted originally. For years we've been thinking, well, Dexters would be a good breed for us. We kind of talked, my wife really likes the Scottish Highlanders. And I don't think we have a good, it's too hot here for them. I mean, at least I would think so, but I think that Dexters, they're definitely seem to be a good fit for our homestead so far. And that's our Dexter story. I do, I want to get them up here. I'm not going to be in a big hurry. Although right now you can, on Craigslist, you can actually get them at a decent price. A lot of people are selling them because it was been dry and they can't afford the hay. The hay prices are high, so that's kind of a couple things I guess we can talk about would be like, my strategy for winter is I'm planning I'm going to have to feed for up to 60 days. So I tried to do the whole calculation and figured in some waste and but I got my bales a while, but it was hard to find hay right now. This part of Missouri, they're bringing it in. I did find a guy that was a little further east of here where they got more rain. He was able to get some cuttings, but it was $100 a bale for 4x5 bales. I got some alfalfa that came in from, I think, Kansas, and that I was giving to the cow as I was milking her. And then I kind of use that as a treat. The Dexters really like it, and the goats come up and they'll eat it from your hands. So that's more, I don't feed a lot of that. That's more so just for candy. But, my plan is I have enough to at least go 60 days, and I'm trying to stockpile as much as my property as I can, kind of grazing things early. And then there's stuff that didn't get grazed that I'm going to let go for winter and try to graze them on that.
So that's really a great benefit you have, that you're able to graze your cows over on your neighbor's property, start stockpiling and getting ready for winter.
Yeah, it was a huge blessing. I kind of thought about if I didn't have that, it would have been it'd probably been a little tougher. I definitely would need more hay. So I know they intend to do a lot of it in hay, but there's a lot of it that actually kind of grew up, has a lot of trees in it and a lot of brush. So I don't know if they're going to spend if it's going to be worth them to clear like that couple acres over in the corner, kind of where I'm grazing right now. I'm kind of hoping that maybe the guy that's doing the hay decides that it's not worth his time, and I can lease it for grazing for next summer too. Even if it's just basically just for a couple months in the summer, I think it would be worth it, just because I only need to lease like 5 or 10 acres would be enough for summer grazing for them.
Yeah, that sounds like an excellent plan. Well, Joshua, we need to move on to our overgrazing section, where we take a deeper dive into something you're doing on your operation. And we have a little bit different topic today than usual. And as you said earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about mushrooms. And if you've watched any of Greg Judy's videos, he's big about mushrooms. So I'm excited to find out more about it. My knowledge is basically zero.
It's been kind of early on in our homesteading permaculture journey. We kind of got turned on to mushrooms, inoculating mushrooms, mainly for shiitake. I've also done it for lion's manes, but shiitakes are kind of our main ones that we've been doing. And with the goal of actually that being kind of our primary goal, our primary business. So like I said, I'm working from home, so I'm not really getting any profits, trying to get profits off of my homestead at this point. We're just taking care of ourselves, but I do intend to try to build this into at least a little bit of a side business. So our property, like I said, has a lot of mature oaks, but it also has a lot of younger oaks that are perfect at the size for mushrooms. So since I'll just kind of go into what it is. So you can either take branches or young oaks, basically 3 to say 8 inches in diameter, a log about, just call it 3 foot long. You go through and you drill a series of holes, like kind of a diamond pattern holes across it. I started out when I first did it just with like a drill bit. It took a while. Well, you can use an angle grinder and like a high speed drill in it, and it goes real fast. So you drill the holes in the log, and then Field and Forest products, I think it's fieldandforest.com. there's other companies out there, but they'll sell a spawn. So you get the spawn, and it's a sawdust, and it's been inoculated with mycelium from shiitakes and there's all different strains that you can get based on the fruiting temperature and the fruit form and size. And you inoculate the logs, you kind of plant the logs, you take a wax, food grade wax, you seal up all the holes. And then basically you let them logs sit in a shaded spot and keep them somewhat moist, about an inch or so worth of precipitation, or you got to water them every week just so that they don't dry out, so that they last longer for you. And about after, depending on the strain, 6 to 12 months, they start fruiting for mushrooms, and they'll last for several years. You can do a force fruit where you soak them and then you can kind of time your fruitings more, or you can kind of let them fruit naturally. We've been doing it naturally. Once I ramp up, my plan is once we ramp up more into a production mode, I would soak them so that I could get at least somewhat predictable harvests. That's kind of what we're going to use our wooded area for, is what they call a log yard. So essentially just a shaded area. We intend to also develop those areas around there. It's a good area to kind of run ducks through your log yards, which we've done ducks before, but you can kind of graze ducks through there. I think when they're not fruiting, you could graze, goats through that area, just to help keep things cleaned up, make sure the poison and other things aren't taking over the log yard. So you can use your animals in this. And again, with creating silvopasture, what I really want to do is coppice a lot of the younger oaks. So if you go in and do what a coppice cut is, a cut in 2 to 3 foot, cut it on a little bit of a slant so that water will shut off the stump. But eventually from the base of that, you'll get another, other oak trees will start growing up. But if you let them grow up again into another, like a 4-inch branch, 4 to 5 inch branch is about perfect. So you let them grow up to that diameter, about, 5 years, they might be there, and then you can cut them again. So it's a constantly regenerating system to be able to have these oak logs to be able to cultivate mushrooms. And then once the logs are spent, you can use them, basically just kind of throw them in a bigger compost pile. You can use them for something in permaculture that they call hugelkultur mounds, which are kind of like a planting bed that uses a lot of kind of a dead wood medium to hold water and retain water within your garden beds. So there's, it's kind of a full kind of closed, for the most part, closed loop cycle within the homestead. So that's kind of my biggest thing. And how can I utilize animals on both ends, within the silvopasture area where I'm essentially growing my stock for creating logs every year, so it's usually a fall winter process. When they're dormant is when you want to cut them, so go through, cut them, and then come back and clean up our log yards as necessary with using the animals. Like I said, ducks work great because snails are a big predator, a big pest. Shouldn't say big, but they're your probably biggest pest with a mushroom is going to be snails if you have a lot of snails. But ducks love snails. They go through the soil, they go through all the leaves and find them, eat them for you. So integrating animals in all your different systems is really helpful.
Now, I've got a couple of questions for you. You mentioned using oak logs to do it. I'm assuming you can use other species as well, but you chose oak logs because they're available or because of the type of mushroom you wanted?
Mainly availability, and also they're probably the oak is going to be your best for shiitake. You can use other woods. Other woods are, there's a whole list of what you can, what works, what doesn't work. It's just that the oak is a nice dense wood, and the denser the wood, the longer it's going to fruit for you. Because basically as that mycelium goes through there and it kind of breaks it all down, it's just the denser the wood, the longer the life of the log will be, But yes, you can use other species.
And with your ducks, you've talked about grazing them through. Will they not bother the mushrooms when they're fruity?
They might, so that's you'd have to time your grazing so that your log yards aren't fruiting when you're grazing them through there. So, but they wouldn't be too bad because a lot of them, you stack them up. So most of the mushrooms will probably be up and out of reach. The ducks aren't like a chicken. They're not going to jump up on top of the pile, so they're pretty much just going to hang on the ground and And then, when we talk about species, I've always used khaki Campbell's is what I've kind of liked. They're a pretty good egg layer. I think, they probably give a good 200 eggs per hen per year. We've incubated them over the years, incubated some of our own eggs, and we've eaten a few of the extra drakes, and, they're pretty good. They eat about like probably better than a wild duck for sure, but you get about as much of a breast and leg meat out of it that you get out of a wild duck, but they're pretty decent. But the eggs are delicious. The eggs are thicker than a chicken egg, good for dippy eggs, or, what we call, or, over easy eggs. And, they're good for omelets too. They're nice and thick for making omelets.
We don't have any ducks, but I've thought about getting some, but just mainly for aesthetic purposes. I like the black and white magpies. I think they're interesting.
When it comes to duck eggs, I have had, our ducks are on a pasture. So they're not on a pond. I'm basically, the ducks actually, they can be messier. That's why I do tend to move them a bit. And I'm actually moving their waters pretty much every day. And I just use like a 3-gallon pan, rubber pan, because it works good in the wintertime when it freezes. You can just knock the block of ice out, and put some fresh water in for them. But they need to have a little bit, they need to have enough water that they can get their beaks in there and keep their nostrils cleaned out and stuff like that from when they're eating and then when they dig in the mud. So I'll usually give them about 2 of those pans just for, a half a dozen ducks or so. You could run more, but I like to have plenty of option, plenty of water for them, but they don't run. So the point is, though, they don't run on ponds. I've had duck eggs from people that had ponds where the ducks were eating fish and stuff. And there was definitely a stronger, fishy flavor to the eggs versus if they're pastured raised ducks, they're not going to have any different of a taste than a chicken egg. Like I said, it's just, they're slightly, I would call it a little bit of a thicker egg. Bakers love supposedly like duck eggs. I know my wife, when she bakes, she uses the duck eggs for the most part in most of her baking.
Oh, that is interesting. It doesn't surprise me. That stands to reason, because with milk cows, you have to be careful what you graze them, or you can flavor that milk. So I could see that happening. I had never really thought about it. And then on the baking aspect, my wife's an excellent cook, but she tells me she's not a baker. So maybe that contributes to the no duck eggs. Joshua, it is time for us to move on to our famous 4 questions. For our famous 4 questions, same 4 questions we asked of all of our guests. Our very first question: what is your favorite grazing grass related book or resource?
So I'm actually going to say the Stockman Grass Farmer, which is kind of, I think I'm probably on the small end of things when it comes to, getting the Stockman Grass Farmer. I only have 20 acres, but I've noticed in a lot of Joe's kind of comments and some of his columns and stuff, he's talking about the kind of influx of homesteaders that have been subscribing to the Stockman Grass Farmer. And I didn't even know it was out there until I listened to a lot of John Kemp's Regenerative Agriculture podcast. Somebody along the line had recommended that, and I would say that's probably my number one favorite. I have the subscription, and then I went and bought a bunch of back issues because you can get them a lot cheaper. So I went online, and when I get done with the current one, I just have an old one, and I'll start to read through, and I keep it in my other office if you kind of know what I mean. And that's what that's kind of where I get a lot of reading done. And it's, cause it's hard to read a lot this time of year. In the winter time, I do a lot more reading by the wood stove in the evenings. So when it comes to an actual book, I just started reading a lot of grazing books. I've always kind of just read a lot of different permaculture related books, but the Joe Salatin Salad Bar Beef is definitely an entertaining read, a good read. I have his Pastures for Poultry, which I haven't read yet, but I've probably watched every YouTube video that's kind of been out there on Joe Salatin style chickens over the year. But, there's so many good resources, and that Stockman Grass Farmer, Greg Judy's books are in there. Everybody's books are in there, and there's no shortage of educational materials out there.
There's not. From books to YouTube channels to podcasts to websites, there is a huge selection out there to fuel whatever learning style you have and whatever time you have. Our second question, Joshua, what is your favorite tool for your farm?
It's probably the electric fencing, because honestly, I have, my perimeter fence is kind of broke down. It would be tough to cross fence to be able to rotational graze. I wouldn't be able to graze a neighboring property if it wasn't for Premier One fence. I know there's other products. I don't know, Premier One is what came across the board, the radar first for me. And I kind of got in with Premier One as far as that's where I started buying it. And it just becomes a go-to. They're in Iowa, I'm in Missouri. It's, unless shipping, which shipping can get messed up anytime. But I've gotten stuff as quick as like almost the next day. If I order it early enough in the morning, it can sometimes be there, the following evening. But if not, it's at least, 3 days you have stuff from them. And it's a very versatile tool, like we were talking about earlier. Although I'm a bit of a Luddite in many ways and kind of don't necessarily always completely have a great value in a lot of the newer technologies and stuff. However, I don't know, like I said, it's allowing us to do something as homesteaders that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. We wouldn't be out here grazing animals if it wasn't for electric, polywire, polyrope, electric netting, the whole 9 yards. Ideally, I'd love to have a bunch of hedgerow, nice thick hedgerows that were impenetrable, but that's a long ways out. So until then, I'm going to be using the wire and the electric, the solar chargers.
So true. And Premier One's a great supplier there. There's some others as well. It's whoever works best for you is great. Our third question, what would you tell someone just getting started?
Well, I guess I'd be talking to myself, but, I guess if they don't have animals yet, definitely, I would say I'm not going to say I bit off too much, but I bit off a lot and I'm still chewing and trying to keep up. But you talk about it with other guests, you just kind of have to get started. You just got to try to do something. But the biggest thing is make sure that before you bring an animal onto the property, make sure you know where it's going to go and you got a home for it. I've been guilty of that a time or two where I might have had something set up for mainly poultry, not for bigger livestock, but I brought young chicks on and, because I had brooders set up and I had something intermediate, but maybe didn't have a full, and I'm scrambling last minute to get something built. So jump in, but make sure you're doing your research and you have a plan, at least, 2 steps ahead. You're going to think at least 2 steps ahead where they're going to be. Otherwise you're going to fall behind.
You mentioned that about buying poultry and you had part of the facility set up ready to go, but you still had to get a little bit done. I may be guilty of that once in a while too. You think, oh, I got all this time. I'll have it done by then. And then you're rushing around to get it done in time. And Joshua, last question for you. Where can others find out more about you?
Well, so I guess that's part of the thing. I'm not a social media guy, so I don't have a big presence. I do have a website that I actually just launched. I've had it for a little bit, but I didn't launch it until the end of this winter. And it's really not so much about me or even my farm. It's more about my some of my ideology and theology when it comes to we as created beings should be kind of rethinking the way that the current trajectory of the world that it's going and try to think of, change trajectory and try to do things in a more regenerative way. Think about regenerative agriculture. Think about, I've drawn a lot of inspiration recently from Wendell Berry, so I know one of your last guest, actually that podcast just came out recently, but it was Benton Lane had brought up about Wendell Berry. And I just kind of thought that was interesting because I was listening to that podcast today and he said that he got inspiration from him. And that's kind of my website is on that line, but it's very small. There's not much really information. The name of my website is voiceinthewilderness permaculture.com. So I kind of got the domain maybe a year ago or something like that, and sat on it for a while trying to think what was my goal? What's my goal with that? And in the past year, I've been so busy on the homestead, I really haven't had time to really post much of anything on the website. So people can go there, but there's maybe like 2 articles there or, 2 blog posts, and that's about it. But yeah, I appreciate it. If I start getting a little more traffic there, it'll inspire me to spend a little bit more time and write a few more things. And I do want to try to record some of the progress that I'm doing and probably post that on there, because it's, that's my goal. I want people to know that there are other options. I think that we can use technology as a good tool. I think the biggest thing is not allowing technology to control us, but we control the technology and kind of live a lifestyle where a lot of people can work from home. That's a great blessing that I have that I realize not everybody can have, but it enables me to be here on the homestead and kind of being able to keep tabs on things throughout the day. So that's where technology has played a big role in being able to do this.
Well, Joshua, we really appreciate you coming on and sharing about your journey today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the podcast, what you do. It's very informational. I like to listen to them during the day while I'm working. I'll try to listen to a podcast or two, get some time in during the day to listen to one in the background. And, they're helpful in this whole journey, because I'm like, well, that's a great idea. Why didn't I think of that? Somebody brings it up, and you have a great line of questioning, really, really helps draw out some information from people to be helpful to other grazers.
You're listening to the Grazing Grass Podcast, helping grass farmers learn from grass farmers. And every episode features a grass farmer and their operation. If you've enjoyed today's episode and want to keep the conversation going, visit our community at community.grazinggrass.com. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to the Grazing Grass Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube for past and future episodes. We also welcome guests to share about their own grass farming journey. So if you're interested, fill out the form on grazinggrass.com under the Be Our Guest link. Until next time, keep on grazing grass.